The Wild Swans. Far from here, in a country where the swallows fly in our winter time, there dwelt a king. He had 11 sons and one daughter, called Elise. The 11 brothers, they were real princes, went to school with stars on their breasts and swords at their sides, and they wrote on golden tablets with diamond pens and were so clever that they knew everything by heart. In short, it was easy to see that they were princes. The little sister Elise used to sit on a little glass stool and read a picture book, which had cost half the kingdom. Yes, the children had a good time, but they were not to remain happy. Their mother was dead, and now their father, the king of all the country, married a very wicked woman who was not at all kind to the poor children. They found this out on the first day after the marriage, when they had a grand gala at the palace. The children played at having company, but instead of having as many cakes and sweetmeats as usual, the wicked queen gave them only some sand in a dish and told them to imagine it was something nice. The following week, the wicked queen sent little Elise to be brought up by some peasants in the country, and it was not long before she had told the king so many falsehoods about the poor princes that they were no longer fond of them. "Go out in the world and look for yourselves," said the wicked queen. "Fly away in the shape of large, speechless birds." But she could not make their transformation as disagreeable as she wished. The princes were changed into 11 white swans. Sending forth a strange cry, they flew out of the palace windows, over the park, and over the wood. It was still early in the morning when they passed by the farmhouse where Elise lay sleeping. Several times they flew around the roof and stretched their long necks and flapped their wings, but no one heard or saw them. They were forced to fly away, up into the clouds and into the wide world. So on they went to the large dark forest, which extended as far as the seashore. Poor little Elise stood in the peasant's cottage amusing herself with a green leaf, for she had no other plaything. She pricked a hole into the leaf and peeped through it at the sun. Then she fancied she saw her brother's clear, bright eyes looking down at her, and whenever the warm rays of the sun shone upon her cheeks, she thought of her brother's loving kisses. One day passed exactly like the other, and when the wind blew through the thick hedges of rose trees in front of the house, she would whisper to the roses, "Who is more beautiful than you?" But the roses would shake their heads and say, "Elise." And when on Sundays the peasant's wife sat at the door of the cottage reading her hymn book, the wind would rustle the leaves and say to the book, "Who is more pious than you?" "Elise." The hymn book would reply, and what the roses in the hymn book said was no more than the truth. When Elise was 15 years old, she was sent to be home. But when the queen saw how beautiful she was, she began to hate the poor girl with all her heart, and she would have liked to transform her into a wild swan like her brothers. She dared not do so, however, because the king was anxious to see his daughter. So the next morning the queen went to the bath made entirely of marble, and fitted up with soft pillows and gay carpets. She took 3 toads and kissed them, and said to one, "You will sit down on Elise's head when she enters this bathroom, and that she may be as dull and sleepy as you are. You settle upon her forehead," she said to the second toad, "and let her become ugly like you, so that her father may not know her again, and you place yourself upon her bosom." She said to the third, "That her heart may become evil with a torment to herself." Then she put the toads into the clear water, which was immediately tinted with a green color. Then she called Elise, undressed her, and made her get into the water. The one toad settled on her hair, one on her forehead, and the third on her bosom, but Elise did not seem at all aware of it. She rose up, and 3 poppies were seen swimming on the water. Had the toads not been poisonous and kissed by a witch, they would have changed into roses when resting on Elise's head and heart, for she was too good for magic to have power over her. When the queen saw this, she rubbed walnut juice all over the maiden's skin, so that she became quite swarthy, smeared with nasty smelling salve over her lovely face, and entangled her long, thick hair. After this, it was impossible to recognize beautiful little Elise. When her father saw her, he was shocked and said she could not be his daughter. No one wanted anything to have to do with her apart from the old dog and the swallows, but they, poor dumb animals, could not say anything in her favor. Poor Elise wept and thought of her 11 brothers, not one of whom she saw in the palace. Sadly, she stole away and wandered a whole day over fields and moors till she reached the forest. She did not know where to go, but she was very distressed and longed so much to see her brothers. She was certain that they, too, had been driven out into the world. She determined to seek and to find them. She had not been in the forest long when night fell, and she lost her way in the darkness. She lay down on the soft moss and said her evening prayer, and leaned her head against the trunk of a tree. It was very still in the forest. The air was mild, and around her gleamed the tiny light of many hundred glowworms. And when least likely touched one of the branches hanging over her, bright insects fell down upon her like falling stars. All night she dreamed of her brothers. They were all children again. They played together. They wrote on their diamond pens and golden tablets, and looked at the pictures in the beautiful book which cost half a kingdom. But they did not, as before, make only straight strokes and thoughts on the tablet. No, they wrote in bold actions, like they had performed in strange adventures they had encountered. And in the picture book, everything seemed alive. The birds sang, the men and women stepped from the book and talked to Elise and her brothers. However, when she turned over the leaves, they jumped back into their places, so that the pictures did not get mixed up. When Elise woke, the sun was already high in the sky, and she could not really see it, for the tall trees of the forest closely entwined their thickly leaved branches, which, as the sunbeams played upon them, looked like a golden veil waving to and fro. The air was fragrant, and the birds perched upon Elise's shoulders. There were several springs forming a pool with the prettiest pebbles on the bottom. Brushes were growing thickly around it, and the deer had trodden a broad path around them, and by this Elise went down to the water's edge. The water was so clear that, had not the bushes and boughs been moved to and fro by the wind, she might have fancied that they were painted upon a smooth surface. So distinctly was each little leaf mirrored upon it, whether glowing in the sunlight or lying in the shade. As soon as Elise saw her face reflected in the water, she was quite startled, so brown and ugly did it look. However, when she had wetted her little hand and rubbed her brows and eyes, white skin again appeared. She took off her clothes and stepped into the fresh water, and in the whole world there's not a king's daughter more beautiful than she'd seen. After she had dressed again and had braided her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring and drank out of the hollow of her hand, and then wandered farther into the forest. She did not know where she was going, but she thought of her brothers and of the good God who, she felt, would not forsake her. He it was who led her to the tree whose boughs bent under the weight of their fruit. She made her meal under its shade and propped up its boughs, then walked on amid the dark twilight of the forest. It was so still that she could hear her own footsteps and the rustling of each withered leaf that crushed beneath her feet. Not a bird was to be seen, not a sunburn penetrated the thick foliage. The tall trunks of the trees stood so close together that they seemed to form a trellis work. There was solitude here, such as Elise had never known before. The night was very dark, and not a single glowworm sent forth its light. Sadly, she lay down to sleep, and then it seemed to her as though the boughs above her head opened, and she saw an angel looking down upon her with gentle eyes, and 1,000 little cherubs around him. When she awoke in the morning, she could not tell whether this had been a dream, or whether she had really been so watched over. She walked on a little further, and met an old woman with a basket full of berries. The old woman gave her some of them, and Elise asked her if she had seen 11 princes ride through the wood. No, said the old woman, but yesterday I saw 11 swans with golden crowns on their heads swim down the river that flows quite near this place. And she led Elise to a little farmer on the precipice, and the base of which was washed by a brook. The trees on each side stretched their long leafy branches towards each other, and where they could not unite, the roots had disengaged themselves from the earth and hung their interlaced fibers over the water. Elise bade the old woman farewell and wandered by the side of the stream until she came to a place where it reached the open sea. The great, beautiful sea lay extended before the maiden's eyes, but not a ship, not a boat was to be seen. How was she to go on? She noticed numerous little stones on the shore, which the waves had shaped in a round form. Glass, iron, stone, everything laid scattered there had been molded into shape. And yet the water which had done all this was much softer than Elise's delicate little hand. "It rolls on untiringly," she said, "and subdues what is so hard. I shall work no less untiringly. Thank you for the lesson you've given me, you bright rolling waves. Some day my heart tells me you will carry me to my dear brothers." On the wet seaweed there lay 11 white swan feathers. Elise collected them in a bunch, and drops of water hung about them. Whether they were dew or tears, she could not tell. She was quite alone on the seashore, but she did not care, for the sea presented an eternal variety. When a black cloud passed across the sky, it was as if the sea were saying, "I, too, can look dark." And then the wind would blow the waves and fling out their white foam. When the clouds would shone like a bright red tint and the winds were asleep, the sea, too, looked like a rose leaf. It was now green, now white, but however peacefully it responded, there was always a light breeze on the shore, causing the water to heave gently on the bosom of a sleeping child. At sunset, Elise saw 11 wild swans with golden crowns on their heads fly towards the land. They flew one behind another, looking like a streaming white ribbon. Elise climbed down the precipice and concealed herself behind a bush. The swans settled closer and flapped their long white wings. As the sun sank behind the water, the swans vanished, and in their place stood 11 handsome princes, Elise's brothers. She uttered a loud cry, for although they have changed much, Elise felt that they must be her brothers. She ran into their arms and called them by their names, and how happy they were to see and recognize their sister, now grown so tall and beautiful. They laughed and wept and soon realized how wickedly their stepmother had treated them. "We," said the eldest of the brothers, "fly or swim as long as the sun is above the horizon, but when it sinks we can appear again in human form. We must therefore see to it that at sunset we have a safe resting place, for if we are seen flying among the clouds we should fall down as we resumed our own form. We do not live here. The land is quite beautiful as this lies on the opposite side of the sea, but it is far off. To reach it we have to cross the deep waters, and there is no island midway on which we may rest the night. One little rock rises from the waves, just large enough for us to stand on it side by side, and when the sea is rough and we are sprinkled with its foam. But we are thankful for the resting place. Without it, we would never be able to visit our dear native country. Once a year, this is the only visit to our father's home is permitted. We require 2 of the longest days of flight, and can remain only 11 days, during which time we fly over the large forest, whence we can see the palace in which we were born, and where our father dwells, and the tower of the church in which our mother is buried. Here, even the trees and bushes seem akin to us. Here the wild horses still race over the plains in the days of our childhood. Here the charcoal burner sings the same old tunes to which we used to dance in our youth. Here is our home, and here we have found you again, dear little sister. We have still 2 days longer to stay here. Then we must fly across the sea to the land, beautiful indeed, but not our motherland. But how shall we take you with us? We have neither ship nor raft." "How shall I be able to release you?" said the sister. So they went on talking the whole night, discussing the problem. They slumbered only a few hours. Elise was awakened by the rustling of swans' wings, which were fluttering above her. Her brothers were once again transformed. For some time they flew around her in large circles, and at last they flew far, far away. But one of them had remained behind. He was the youngest. He laid his head on her lap, and she stroked his white wings. The whole day they remained together. Toward evening the others came back, and when the sun set they again stood on firm ground in their natural form. "Tomorrow we shall fly away again," they said. We dare not return for a whole year, but we cannot leave you here alone. Have you the courage to accompany us? Our arm is strong enough to carry you through the forest. We shall not be our combined wings suffice strength to carry you across the sea. Oh, yes, please, take me with you, said Elise. They spent the whole night weaving a mat of piled willow bark and rough rushes, and their mat was thick and strong. Elise lay down on it, and when the sun had risen, the brothers were again transformed into wild swans. They seized the mat with their beaks and flew up high among the clouds with their dear sister, who was still asleep. The sunbeams shone full upon her face, so one of the swans who flew over shaded her with his broad wings. They were already far from land when Elise woke. She thought she was still dreaming, so strange it had appeared to her to be traveling through the air and over the sea. By her lay a cluster of pretty berries that sang full of savory roots. Her youngest brother had collected them and laid them for her there, and then she thanked him with a smile, for she knew him as the swan who flew overhead and shaded her with his wings. They flew so high that the ship they saw beneath them seemed like a white seagull skimming over the water. Elise saw behind her a large cloud. It looked like a mountain, and on it she saw a gigantic shadow of herself and the 11 swans. It formed a picture more splendid than any she had ever seen before. Soon, however, the sun rose higher, and the cloud remained far behind, and then the floating, shadowy picture disappeared. The whole day they continued flying with a whirring noise, somewhat like an arrow, but they traveled more slowly than usual. They had to carry their sister. The heavy tempest was gathering. The evening approached. Anxiously, Elise watched the sun. It was setting. Still, a solitary rock could not be seen. It appeared to her that the swans plied their wings with increasing vigor. Alas, it would be her fault if her brothers did not arrive at the place in time. They would become human beings when the sun set, and if this happened before they reached the rock, they would fall into the sea and be drowned. She prayed to God most fervently, and still no rock was to be seen. The black clouds drew nearer. Violent gusts of wind announced the approach of a tempest. The clouds had become fearfully large, dark mass. One flash of lightning rapidly succeeded another. The sun was now on the rim of the sea. Elise's heart trembled violently. The swans shot downward so swiftly that she thought she would fall, but they began to hover. Already the sun had half sunk beneath the water, and at that moment she saw the little rock below her. It looked like a seal's head when he raised it just above the water, and the sun was sinking fast. It seemed scarcely larger than a star. Just then her foot touched the hard ground, and the sun vanished altogether like a last spark of a burnt piece of paper. Linking their arms, her brothers stood around her, and sure enough, there was only room for her and them. The sea beat impetuously upon the rock, flinging over a shower of foam. The sky seemed to continual blaze with fast succeeding flashes of fire that lightened it, and the thunder rolled on, peal after peal. But sister and brothers kept firm hold of each other's hands. They sang a song, and that gave them comfort and courage. By daybreak, the air was clear and still, and as soon as the sun came up, the swans flew away with Elise from the rock. The waves rose higher and higher, and when travelers looked down from the clouds upon the blackish green sea, covered with white foam, they could have imagined that millions of swans were swimming on its surface. The day advanced, and we saw, as if floating on air, a land of mountains intermixed with glaciers, and in the center, a palace a mile in length with splendid colonnades rising above one another. Palm trees and gorgeous-looking flowers as large as mill wheels growing beneath. Elise asked if this was the country which they were flying, but the swan shook her head, for what she saw was the beautiful airy castle of the fairy Morgana, where no human being was ever invited. While Elise still feasted her eyes upon it, mountains, seas, and castle all disappeared, and in their place stood 12 proud churches with high towers and pointed windows. She thought she could hear the organ play, and it was only the murmur of the sea. She was now so close to these churches, but behold, it had suddenly changed into a large fleet of ships sailing under them. She looked down and saw that it was only the sea mists passing rapidly over the water. An eternal variety floated before her eyes until at last the actual land, whither they were bound, appeared in sight. The beautiful blue mountains, cedar woods, towns, and castles rose to view. Long before sunset, Elise was set down on a rock in front of a large cavern. Delicate young creepers grew along it so thickly that it appeared to be covered with gaily embroidered carpets. "Now we shall see what you dream of tonight," said her youngest brother, as he showed her sleeping chamber destined for her. "Oh, that I could dream how you will be released from this spell," she said, and this thought completely occupied her. She prayed most earnestly for God's assistance, and even in her dreams she continued praying. Then it seemed to her that she was flying up high in the air towards the castle of the fairy Morgana. The fairy came forward to meet her. She looked radiant and beautiful, and yet Elise thought she resembled an old woman who had given her the berries in the forest, and had told her the swans with golden crowns. "You can release your brothers," said she, "but will you have sufficient courage and patience? The water is indeed softer than your delicate hands, and yet it can mold the hard stones to its will. But then it cannot feel the pain which your tender fingers will feel. It has no heart, it cannot suffer the anxiety and grief which you suffer. Look at these stinging nettles in my hand. There are many of the same kind growing around the cave where you were sleeping. Only these that grow here and on the graves of the churchyard will be of use. Remember that. You must pick them, although they will sting your hands, but you have to break them with your feet to get the yarn from them. With this yarn you must weave 11 shirts with long sleeves. Throw them over the 11 swans, and the spell will be broken. But mark this. From the moment that you begin your work until it is completed, even should it take you years, you must not speak one word. The first syllable that escapes your lips will pierce your brother's hearts like a dagger. On your tongue depends their life." As she touched Elisa's hand with a nettle, which made it burn like fire, so that Elisa woke. It was broad daylight, and close to her lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dreams. She fell upon her knees and thanked God, and went out of the cave to begin her work. With her delicate hands she picked the ugly, stinging nettles. They made large blisters on her hands and arms, but she bore the pain willingly in the hope of releasing her dear brothers. She broke the nettles with her naked feet and spun the green yarn. At sunset her brothers came home. Elisa's silence frightened them. They thought it must be the effect of some spell her wicked stepmother had cast on them. But when they saw her blistered hands, they realized what their sister had set out to do for them. The youngest brother wept, and as soon as his tears fell upon her hands, Elise felt no more pain, and the blisters disappeared. The whole night she spent in her work, for she could not rest until she had released her dear brothers. All the following day she sat in solitude, for the swans had flown away, but never had time passed so quickly for her. It was not long before the first shirt was completed, and now she began the second. One day, quite suddenly, a hunting horn was sounded in the mountains, and that frightened Elise. The noise came nearer, and she heard the hounds baying. In great terror she fled into the cave, and tied the green yarn which she had spun into a bundle, and sat down upon it. At the same moment, large hounds sprang out from the bushes. 2 others immediately followed. They bayed loudly and ran away, and then returned. It was not long before the huntsman stood in front of the cave. The handsomest among them was the king of that country. He walked up to Elise. Never before had he seen a maiden as lovely as she. "How did you get here, beautiful child?" he asked. Elise shook her head. She was not allowed to speak, for she had spoke to Elise's brothers, but she did hide her hands under her apron so that the king should not see how she was suffering. "Come with me," he said. "You should not stay here. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I shall clothe you in velvet and silk. I shall place a crown upon your head, and you shall live in my palace." He lifted her on his horse, and she wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I only desire your happiness. Some day you will appreciate it." And away he rode over the mountains and valleys, holding her on his horse in front, while the other huntsmen followed. At sunset, the king's magnificent capital with its churches and cupolas lay before them, and the king led Elise into his palace, where the fountains were playing between marble pillars, and where beautiful pictures adorned the walls. But Elise did not care for all the splendor. She wept and mourned in silence, while the attendants dressed her in royal robes, wove costly pearls into her hair, and pulled soft gloves over her blistered hands. As she now stood in the splendid attire, her beauty was so dazzling that the courtiers all bowed low before her. The king chose her for his bride, although his prime minister shook his head and whispered that the beautiful lady of the wood was surely a witch who had blinded their eyes and infatuated the king's heart. But the king did not listen. He ordered the music to be played and a sumptuous banquet to be served. The lovely maidens danced around the bride, and she was led through the fragrant gardens and to magnificent halls. But no smile played upon her lips, and no beam shone from her eyes. The king then showed her into a small room next to her sleeping apartment. It was adorned with costly green tapestry and resembled a cave in which she had found. On the ground lay the bundle of yarn which she had spun from the nettles, and on the wall hung the shirt she had completed. One of the huntsmen had brought all this along, thinking it must mean something wonderful to her. "Here you may dream of your former house," said the king, "and here is the work you did there. Amidst all this pleasant splendor, and sometimes amuse you to remember that time." When Liz saw that this was so dear to her heart, she smiled and color returned to her cheeks. She thought her brothers might still be released, and she kissed the king's hand in gratitude. He, however, pressed her to his heart and covered the bells of the churches to be rung to announce the celebration of their wedding. The beautiful, silent maiden from the woods was to become queen of the land. The prime minister whispered evil words into the king's ears, but they made no impression on him. The marriage was solemnized, and the prime minister himself had to place a crown upon Elisa's head. In his rage, he pressed the sharp-edged rim so firmly on her forehead that it hurt her. But she remained silent. A single word from her would have killed her brothers. Her eyes, however, showed her heartfelt love for the king, who was good and handsome, and who had done so much to make her happy. How she longed to be able to confide all her sorrows to him. But silent she had to remain until her work was completed. To this end, she stole away every night and went into the little room that was fitted up like her cave. There she worked at her shirts, but by the time she had begun the seventh, her yarn had run out. She knew that the nettles she needed grew in the churchyard, but she had to gather them herself. How was she to get them? "What is a pain in the fingers compared to the anguish my heart suffers?" she said to herself. "I must venture to the churchyard. The good God will not withdraw his protection from me." Fearful, as though she were about to do wrong, one moonlit night she crept down to the garden, through the long avenues, and reached the lonely road that led to the churchyard. She saw a number of ugly old witches sitting one by the broadest tombstones. Elise was obliged to pass close by, and the witches fixed their wicked eyes upon her. But she said a quick prayer, gathered the stinging nettles, and took them back into her palace. There was only one person who had seen her. It was the prime minister. He was awake when others slept. Now he was convinced there was something wrong with the young queen. He had been right after all. She must be a witch who had, through her enchantments, infatuated the king and all the people. When they were alone, he told the king what he had seen and what he feared. When the slanderous words came from his lips, the sculptor's images of the king's forebears shook their heads as though they were saying, "It is untrue, Elise's innocence." But the minister explained this miracle in a different way. He said they were shaking their heads about Elise's sinfulness. On hearing this, two large tears rolled down the king's cheeks. Doubt had entered his heart. He pretended to sleep at night, though sleep would never visit him. He noticed that Elise rose from her bed every night, and every time he followed her secretly and saw her enter her little room. His countenance became darker every day. Elise noticed it, but did not know the cause. It grieved her, and besides, what she did not suffer in her own heart for her brothers. Her bitter tears ran down on the royal velvet and purple. They looked like bright diamonds. She had now nearly finished her work. Only one shirt was wanting. Unfortunately, she had not a single nettle left. Once more, only once she would have to go to the somber churchyard and gather a few handfuls. She shuddered when she thought of the solitary walk and the horrid witches. She went, but the king and the minister followed her. They saw her disappear through the churchyard door, and when they came near, they saw the witches sitting on a tombstone. The king turned away, believing that she was one of them. "Let the people judge her," he said. And the people condemned her to be burnt to the stake. Now she was dragged from the king's sumptuous apartments into a damp, dark hole of a prison where the wind whistled through the barred windows. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her a bundle of nettles she had gathered on which to lay her head. The shirts she had woven were to serve as her mattress and counterpane, but they could not have given her anything she valued more. She continued to work at the same time, praying earnestly. Outside, the street urchins sang scandalous songs about her. Not a soul comforted her with one word of love. Towards the evening she heard the rustling of Swan's wings against the bars. It was the youngest of her brothers who had at last found a sister, and she sobbed with joy, although she knew that the coming night would probably be the last of her life. But then her work was almost finished, and her brothers were near. Little mice were scurrying across the floor, busily dragging the nettles to her feet, wishing to help her, and a thrush perched on the iron bars and sang all night to give her courage. It was still twilight, just before the hour of sunrise. But then the 11 brothers stood before the palace gates and requested an audience with the king. But it could not be, they were told. The king was asleep, and nobody dared to wake him. They entreated, they threatened. The guard came up, and the king himself at last stepped out to ask what was the matter. At that moment, the sun rose, and the brothers could be seen no longer. Instead, 11 swans flew away over the palace. The people poured forth from the gates of the city, all eager to see the witch burn. One wretched horse pulled the cart on which Elise had been placed. A coarse frock of sackcloth had been put on her. Her long, beautiful hair hung loosely over her shoulders. Her cheeks were a deadly pallor. Her lips moved gently, and her fingers wove the green yarn. 10 shirts were lying in front of her. She was working on the 11th. "Look at this witch! See how she's muttering!" said the mob. "It is not a hymn book that is in her hand. No, there she sits with her accursed witchery. Tear it from her! Tear it to 1,000 pieces!" And they all crowded about her, and were on the point of snatching away the shirts, when 11 white swans came flying towards the cart. They settled around her and flapped their wings. The crowd gave way in terror. "It is a sign from heaven! She must be innocent," whispered some, but they dared not say it aloud. The sheriff now seized her by the hand. In a moment she threw the 11 shirts over the swans. 11 handsome princes appeared in their place. The youngest had, however, only one arm and a wing instead of the other, for one sleeve was lacking in a shirt. She was not able to finish it. "Now I may speak," she said. "I'm innocent." "Yes, she's innocent," said the oldest brother, and he related their wonderful story. And while he spoke, a fragrance as if from 1,000 roses pervaded the air, for every piece of wood in the funeral pyre had taken root and had sent forth branches, and a hedge of blooming roses surrounded Elise. Above all the other blossoms, a flower of dazzling white. King plucked it and laid it on Elise's bosom, and that action gave her peace and joy of heart. And all the church began to ring their second note, and the birds flew to the spot in swarms. There was a festive procession back to the palace, such as no king has ever seen equaled, and the queen's 11 handsome brothers were the guests of honor.